مرحبا جميعا. أنا الدكتور محمد أسامة الرشدان من قسم الطب النفسي. Today's lecture is one of the lectures in the series of behavioral science lectures for third year medical students, and the subject of today's lecture is learning. So learning in the context of behavioral sciences is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from practice. It is not a temporary change, but one that persists over time. And there are four basic types of learning. The first one is called habituation or habituation. So this occurs when an organism learns to ignore a stimulus that is familiar and inconsequential. For example, a person living near a train station may stop noticing the sound of the train over time. The second type of learning is called classical conditioning. This involves learning that one stimulus predicts another. The Pavlov's experiments are the classic example, where dogs learned to associate the sound of a bell, which is a conditioned stimulus, with food, unconditioned stimulus, leading to salivation, which is called the conditioned response. Then there is the third type of learning, which is called operant conditioning. So operant conditioning, an organism learns that its behavior has consequences, such as reward or punishment. For example, a child learns to clean their room to receive praise or avoid scolding. The fourth type of learning is called complex learning. Now this goes beyond simple associations and involves mental representations and strategies, such as problem solving or understanding abstract concepts. Early research on learning was rooted in behavioral sciences, studying of human behavior and animal behavior. That is referred to generally as behaviorism. This emphasized external causes of behavior and simple associations as the foundation of learning. It assumed that learning principles were universal across species and situations. However, more modern approaches incorporate cognitive factors like mental processes and biological constraints, recognizing that learning is influenced by the organism's genetic makeup and mental representations. So in classical conditioning, classical conditioning is a type of learning where a conditioned stimulus predicts an unconditioned stimulus, leading to a conditioned response. So the Pavlovian or Pavlov's experiments demonstrated this process. What the experiment involved was using a bell, which was the stimulus. This consistently preceded food, causing the dogs, which were the subject of the experiment, to salivate. Over time, the bell alone, without the food, elicited salivation. Stimuli similar to the conditional stimulus can also elicit the conditional response or the conditioned response. This is a phenomenon known as generalization. For example, a dog conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell may also salivate at similar sounds. Then there is discrimination training, which can reduce generalization by teaching the organism to respond only to the specific conditioned stimulus and not to similar stimuli. Now, classical conditioning occurs across species, from flatworms all the way up to humans, showing its universality. Cognitive factors play a role in classical conditioning. For that to occur, the conditioned stimulus must reliably predict the unconditioned stimulus. If the unconditioned stimulus is equally likely to occur with or without the conditioned stimulus, conditioning will not happen. Biological constraints also influence classical conditioning. For example, in rats, rats readily associate sickness with taste, but not with light, while birds associate sickness with light, but not with taste. Now, this would highlight the role of an organism's species, genetic makeup, or its, quote, behavioral blueprint in learning. So just to repeat, there is evidence that the biological constraints are genetically determined, and this is called a behavioral blueprint. Now, this exists in classical conditioning. The examples that have been observed in certain species, like in rats, they would readily learn to associate the feeling of being sick with a taste of a specific solution. They cannot learn to associate sickness, for example, with a light stimulus. On the other hand, birds can learn to associate light and sickness, but not the taste and sickness. This kind of highlights the behavioral blueprints in different species, and points out the complexity and the heterogeneity amongst species as far as learning is concerned. In operant conditioning, this concept, the concept of operant conditioning, involves learning through consequences, where the organism's response operates on the environment. So operant conditioning is behavior or organism's responses that operates on the environment. Thorndike's law of effect states that behaviors followed by reinforcement are strengthened, while those followed by punishment are weakened. Skinner, who was another scientist, expanded on this by studying how animals like rats and pigeons learn to perform specific responses. For example, pressing a lever to obtain reinforcement. The rate of response is used to measure the strength of learning. Shaping is a technique used to teach novel behaviors, which means a totally new behavior that has not been or that is unknown to that organism before. So it involves reinforcing successive approximations of the desired behavior until the final behavior is achieved. For example, teaching a dog to roll over by rewarding small steps, like lying down and then ultimately turning over. In operant conditioning, there are certain phenomena involved. One is called conditioned reinforcement. So in conditioned reinforcement, a stimulus associated with a primary reinforcer like food becomes reinforcing itself. Generalization and discrimination. Responses can generalize to similar situations, but discrimination training can help the organism respond only to a specific stimuli. Reinforcement schedules. This basically means once a behavior is learned, it can be maintained with partial reinforcement. Schedules include fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. An example of reinforcement schedules can be seen in individuals who engage in gambling. One of the more specific examples would be using the slot machines, where when you pull out a lever, you have some chance of winning a certain amount of money, but the chances of you winning the money varies from time to time. The amount of the prize varies from time to time, and you may need to engage in this behavior at different intervals or times to actually get the prize. That's just another example on the human level. The concept of aversive conditioning. Aversive conditioning. Aversion means to avoid. So aversive conditioning basically aims to train or to teach a recipient to avoid certain types of behaviors. So punishment would be a response. A response is followed by an aversive event. Suppressing the behavior. So just to reiterate, punishment is a response, is where a response is followed by an aversive event, suppressing that behavior. In escape, the organism learns to terminate an ongoing aversive event. In avoidance, the organism learns to prevent the aversive event from occurring altogether. Cognitive factors are crucial for operant conditioning. The organism must perceive a connection between its behavior and the reinforcement. Biological constraints also play a role. For example, in pigeons, they learn faster to peck for food, but they would flap their wings to avoid shock, showing that certain behaviors are more easily associated with specific reinforcements. Now, there is also the concept of complex learning. Complex learning involves mental representations and strategies that would go beyond simple associations. According to the cognitive perspective, Learning is the ability to mentally represent aspects of the world and operate on these representations. In animals, studies have shown evidence of complex learning. Examples include in rats, they can develop cognitive maps of their environment, allowing them to navigate mazes effectively. Animals can also learn abstract concepts such as cause and effect relationships. Chimpanzees demonstrate insightful problem solving, where they suddenly understand how to solve a problem and can apply the solution to similar situations. Humans often rely on prior beliefs. So, human beings would rely on prior beliefs when learning relationships between stimuli, even when these beliefs conflict with objective evidence. This can lead to detecting relationships that are not actually present. These phenomena illustrate top-down processing, where existing mental frameworks influence how new information is interpreted and learned. So the next part of this presentation is about the concept of behavior modification. Behavior modification is a therapeutic approach based on learning and conditioning principles. It aims to replace maladaptive behaviors with more appropriate responses. Behaviorists believe that maladaptive behaviors are learned, that these are learned ways of coping with stress and can be unlearned using techniques derived from experimental research. While gaining insight into behavior is valuable, it does not guarantee behavioral change. For example, a person may understand why they procrastinate, but still struggle to stop doing that. The first step in behavior modification is to clearly define the problem and identify the specific behaviors that need to change. The therapist and the client then will collaborate to design a treatment program tailored to the individual's needs. Examples of methods of behavior modification. So there are several approaches or methods that are used and applied to modify behavior. One of them is called systematic desensitization. In systematic desensitization, there is gradual exposure to anxiety-provoking stimuli while practicing relaxation techniques at the same time. For example, a person with a specific fear, a fear of heights, may start by imagining being on a high place and then gradually progressing to standing on a balcony. This can be followed by more challenging exercises until the individual is desensitized. Another type of behavioral modification is called in vivo exposure. The other name for this approach is called flooding. This basically entails direct and prolonged exposure to the feared stimulus until the anxiety diminishes. For instance, a person afraid of spiders may be exposed to a spider until their fear subsides. A third type of behavioral modification is selective reinforcement. This actually involves encouraging desired behaviors by rewarding them while ignoring or punishing maladaptive behaviors. For example, praising a child for completing homework while ignoring the child's tantrums. Modeling is a behavioral modification technique derived from the theories of social learning. In modeling, an individual acquires new behaviors, skills, or response patterns through observational learning. The learner observes a model performing a target behavior and subsequently imitates the model, with learning influenced by factors such as the model's perceived competence, similarity to the observer, and the observed consequences of behavior. Behavioral rehearsal is a therapeutic technique in which an individual practices a desired behavior in a structured, simulated setting prior to real-life implementation. It is commonly used to enhance skill acquisition, increased behavioral competence, and reduce anxiety. This process typically includes role-playing, feedback, and repeated practice to strengthen correct behavioral responses and promotes generalization to real-world contexts. This, for example, can be applied in a situation where an individual has fear of public speaking. So the individual would rehearse public speaking in front of a very, very small audience or one individual, getting feedback from that individual, or more than one individual, like two individuals, for example, family members, friends, and then gradually increase the practice until they reduce the anxiety associated with this task. Yet another behavioral modification technique is called self-regulation. This refers to the individual's capacity to monitor, evaluate, and modify their own behavior in accordance with internal standards and long-term goals. This involves cognitive and behavioral processes such as self-monitoring, self-evaluation, and self-reinforcement, allowing the individual to exert voluntary control over their actions in the absence of external contingencies. There is one term that actually is used to describe this in psychology and psychiatry, and it's called mindfulness-based therapy. As the term implies, the individual must develop the ability to be mindful or observant and aware of their self, including their mental processes, their emotional tone, and their responses or behaviors, and to work continuously to modify their thoughts, their emotions, and their behaviors. This means this individual actually needs to make a conscious effort continually, repeatedly, until they achieve the final modification for a specific behavior.